Coming back, we'll be joined by Dr. Raymond Moody and Glimpses of Eternity. I'm George Knapp. This is Coast to Coast AM. I actually had a chance to meet and interview Dr. Raymond Moody, interview for television some years ago when he lived here in Las Vegas. He was chairman, I think, of the human consciousness department, a department or a program that existed at UNLV for a period. Yeah, at least he held the chair there, and got to meet him and talk to him, and I was hooked. I was hooked a long time ago, though, on this subject of life after life. As I mentioned, that book has sold millions of copies. And Dr. Moody, great to have you here. Great to talk to you again.
Oh, George, it's just great to hear from you, too. Man, I often think back to our years there in Las Vegas, and I really enjoyed our time together. We crossed paths on numerous occasions during that time.
Tell me this, am I overselling the impact of life after life, how it has changed the way the world looks at death?
And George, to my utter astonishment, I don't think you are. I mean, I was just amazed. I had encountered this phenomenon of the near-death experience when I was an undergraduate philosophy student at the University of Virginia in 1962 when I read about this in Plato's Republic, and some of the other ancient Greek philosophers studied these near-death experiences. And then while I was there at UVA as a philosophy student, I met Dr. George Ritchie, who was a psychiatry professor there who had such an experience. And I was intrigued immediately by this. It was just, to me, amazing. And Dr. Ritchie, a very fine and upright, wonderful man. And since that time, I've had the opportunity to interview many thousands of people from all around the world who've had this experience. But when I was writing that book in 1974, based on, at that time, about 150 cases, I really had no idea that it would have the impact that it has. But I think that, as you say, this has sort of changed society's image of what it's like to die, and it's gone all around the world. Now, at the same time, it doesn't have anything to do with Raymond Moody. What it had to do with was, I think, the fact that by the 1960s and 70s, the availability of this cardiopulmonary resuscitation had created a pool of such vast numbers of people who had this experience that eventually someone was just going to draw attention to it. And when that happened, which happened to be my book, then it sort of contains its own verification in the sense that I got quite a few comments after Life was published that took the same form, that they said they were reading my book on an airport or in an airplane or on a train or something, and just curious about it, and the person sitting there next to them looked at it and said, "Oh, I had an experience like this." So anybody at that point who just had the courage to sort of step forward and put this out there was bound to get plenty of cases of it. It was just, and I think the message of these experiences is a very positive and hopeful thing, because what people universally tell us who come back from this is that they were absolutely assured by their experience that what we call death is just a transition into another dimension of reality, and secondly, that what this seems to be all about that we're in is to learn how to love. And both of those are very positive messages, I think.
Well, I mean, it's certainly, there's a reason. Your book is excellent. It was well written, as this one is. But there's a universal message here. It touches a nerve with all humans because it focuses on the biggest questions of our existence. What happens after we die? Are we immortal? Do we have a soul? Does life go on after this little experience? And as you mentioned, the answer from the cases that you studied and written about is pretty positive. You mentioned George Ritchie. And you mentioned him in this book, Glimpses of Eternity, as well. Could you just recap that case so we cover the basics of the near-death experience?
George Ritchie was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, and when George was a recruit into the Army during World War II in 1943, he, at the age of 20, he was pronounced dead of double lobar pneumonia and was in this state of apparent cardiac arrest at least 9 minutes. They don't even know how long he had already been apparently dead when the ward boy found his body. And the Dr. Francie, the physician at this Army hospital, after being, the pleading of this ward boy who just couldn't stand to see a person of his own age, so young, die, persuaded Dr. Francie to inject adrenaline into George's heart. And when he did, George came back with this story that when he had come to, he looked and he saw his own body lying there on this hospital bed, and unable to get back into his body, and never having heard anything like this, just utterly baffled. Whereupon suddenly he said the light in the room just grew intensely brilliant, and he suddenly found himself surrounded by a full-color, holographic, three-dimensional panorama and consisting of every single event, every single action he had ever done in his life, and got to review his life in the presence of this being of complete love and compassion. And during this time, George also saw into entirely other realms of existence. And I heard this story directly from George Ritchie himself in 1965. I was 20 years old at that time, and especially after hearing it in the context of already the admiration I felt toward Plato and the ancient Greek philosophers, this just cinched it for me. And then when I became a philosophy professor in 1969, I began to hear these same stories from my students. Then I went on to medical school in '72, and began to hear a lot of them from patients that I worked with. And, what we found, George, is, all over the world, physicians in every society have examined this and found this same pattern of experience worldwide, in which people say that at this point that their doctor thinks that they're dead, often in the course of a cardiac arrest or whatever, that they may actually hear the doctor say words to the effect, "Oh my God, he's dead," or "We've lost her," or words like that. But they say at this point they undergo a very dramatic transition, excuse me, a perspective on this situation, and suddenly find themselves viewing their own physical bodies from a point of view up above. And then through this, as it gradually dawns on them that this is what we call death, they find themselves entering into a state of consciousness that no matter how articulate they may be, however well educated, however many languages they may speak, they say there just are no words to describe it. But insofar as they are able to put words to it, they say that they enter into another domain of existence which consists of sheer light, and that seems to be composed almost of complete love and comfort and compassion. And in that light, say that relatives or friends of theirs who have already died seem to be there almost in the role of a greeting committee. And that, again, as I mentioned, as the experience progresses, they may see everything they've ever done in this panorama. And they relive the panorama or the events of their lives in this panorama, not from the perspective they had when they were doing the actions, but rather they say that in this panorama, you see yourself there as though you're looking at another person, and you recognize it as yourself, but that when the action that you did has its consequence, that you are embedded in the consciousness of those with whom you've interacted. So if you see yourself doing something mean to somebody there, then you feel directly the hurt that you caused in that person's life. Or if you see yourself doing something kind-hearted to a fellow human, then you feel the good feelings you brought about in that person's life. And so, George, I think that we are into a whole new domain of studying this experience, because the way we sort of learned to debate it in our society, the standard format that you're supposed to put this debate into is to say, on the one hand, the people who look at this and they say, well, on the face of it, this seems that, that these people are entering some sort of afterlife realm, or that this is a report from the afterlife. And then on the other hand, there are people who look at it and say, oh, well, sure, they were physiologically compromised, being in this state of cardiac arrest. The oxygen flow to the brain was cut off and so on. And so no wonder that they would have this, because this is all a hallucinatory phenomenon generated by the brain because of the electrochemical reactions taking place in the brain and so on. And our society, this makes a certain sort of superficially plausible case, so people can go back and forth with it. But now you see, just as certainly as we know that this near-death experience is very common among people who almost die and return, with that same certainty we can say, well, also, that identically same experience is also very common among bystanders when somebody dies.
Let's don't jump ahead of ourselves. Yeah. I want to get a little more of the backstory before we get into the shared experience. Sure. You mentioned in the book, of course, the George Ritchie case. Mm-hmm. Isn't there something like where he flew across the country and then and was able to retrace his route years later?
He did. And before I say this, I should say, I'm 67 years old now. George, and I've known a lot of people in my life. I can honestly say that George Ritchie was the finest human being I ever knew. He was just, living in Charlottesville, and I was a physician there myself. And you get to know about somebody like that through things he's done for others and so on. Just an absolutely unflappably terrific man of just immovable integrity and kindness. And yes, he talked about how there at age 20 years old, quite brilliant, he had already graduated from college, but nonetheless, certainly not suspecting that he was going to die anytime soon, and never having thought about this kind of thing, suddenly finds himself out of his body, and he realized nobody could see him, nobody could hear him. He tried to talk to people, nobody would pay any attention to him. So this was in Camp Barkley, Texas. So he got the idea, well, maybe if I go home to Richmond, somebody there maybe, I can get their attention. So he just like suddenly having formulated that thought, he said, that he wanted to go home to Richmond, he suddenly found himself just zooming through the air, kind of like at above treetop level. And then sometime through this got to thinking, well, just a minute. If nobody there in Texas can see me, I don't have any reason to believe that the people there in Richmond can see me either. And besides, my body is back there in Texas. So he decided just to sort of settle down in this little town, like that he was down below, and to try to figure this out. And he said he landed in this little town. He had no idea where he was, and he was at a place where there was a little white diner on a corner on this street. And he said he saw a man walking by, and he tried to ask this man, "Where am I?" And he said the man totally ignored him. So he said he tried to touch this man on the cheek, and he just went right through. And so very, very puzzled. And so then trying to, figure this out again, he went back to his body there in this Army hospital in Texas. Well, about a year later, when he was still in the Army, but he was, at that time, he was having to go back across the country again. And he said he was driving through this little town, and somebody else was driving the car, this other Army officer. But George said they were driving through this little town, and he said George realized it was very familiar, and he also knew he had never been there in real life. And so he realized he was in that little town, and he said he told the driver, if you go down this street about another block, there'll be a little white diner on the corner. And the man said, I thought you'd never been here. He said, I haven't, but go on down there. And so there was the diner. And, coming from George Ritchie, that's amazing. And then,
but I raised that question because there are a lot of examples in your work in the story of people learning things while they're in that other state that turn out to be confirmable over when they're back here.
That's right. And this is, I've just heard some of the most amazing experiences along those lines from utterly trustworthy people, including this wonderful friend of mine, Vi Horton, that I knew for 20-something years before she died a few years ago. But Vi, during her 20-minute cardiac arrest, where the doctor and nurse couldn't hear her or see her, migrated out of the hospital room where she was being resuscitated and saw one of her brothers-in-law there in the hallway of the hospital. And, of course, the brother-in-law couldn't see or hear her, but she said as she was standing there, or as he was standing there, and she was kind of hovering, watching, a man sort of walked down the hospital corridor and, seeing her brother-in-law there, said, "Oh, what are you doing in the hospital?" And
hey, Dr. Moody, I'm going to have to ask you to hold the punchline. That Fats Domino song is telling us we're going to the break. When we come back, we continue this conversation. Also get into Ernest Hemingway and Charles Dickens' touches with the near-death experience, writing about it, and at least in some vein. Our conversation with Dr. Raymond Moody, author of Glimpses of Eternity, continues after these messages on Coast to Coast AM. Dr. Moody, let's continue the story about your friend Vi, who had a 20-minute sort of out-of-body experience, near-death experience, and floated around into the hallway, I guess, at the hospital. Continue the story.
Yes, and saw there her brother-in-law, who was standing there in the hospital corridor, and so of course he couldn't see or hear her, but as she was watching him, a friend of his happened to be in the hospital and walked by and was surprised to see him there and said, "Oh, why are you here at the hospital?" And Vi's brother-in-law said, "Well, I was going to go to Athens today to visit Uncle Henry, but it looks like Vi's going to kick the bucket, so I'm going to have to be around to be a pallbearer." So Vi took note of that, and then several days later, after she had been resuscitated and regained consciousness, her brother-in-law came to see her, and when he walked into the hospital room, she said, "By the way," she said, "the next time I die, I want you to go on to Athens to see Uncle Henry because I'm going to be fine." And incidentally, I talked in detail about this event with her brother-in-law, who was a very, very sort of strict businessman type. And this event just absolutely, totally changed his life, absolutely.
As it has for so many people on both sides of the equation. I think the most persuasive part of the new book, Glimpses of Eternity, is the fact that the critics who say this can't be true, it's a neurological response, it's people who their brains are firing all this stuff off, they're dreaming it, whatever the explanation. Because there's only one witness, so people say, I went over there, I came back, you have to believe me, it was all true. But in this case, the shared experience, you've got multiple witnesses, independent confirmation from several people in many of these cases that it all really happened.
Absolutely, and also, since the bystanders are not ill or injured, there's nothing wrong with the blood flow to their brain, and yet they have identically the same experiences that we call near-death experiences, including, George, the panoramic life review. I have quite a number of cases in which the bystander empathically co-lived the dying life review of the person who passed away. And, I mean, there are enough of these cases that anybody who wants to sincerely investigate this is going to be able to find cases of it. And what does that mean? I mean, we're into a realm here where these kind of pat explanations by the so-called skeptics, and not to be abrasive, George, but, as you know, I was a professor of ancient Greek philosophy and logic before I went to medical school, and it's, the people who call themselves skeptics aren't skeptics at all. The way they talk makes it clear that they, haven't even studied the concept enough to know what it means. But basically, this idea that we can dismiss this as brain damage or electrochemical disturbance in the brain, it typically comes from people who haven't really talked to patients. By and large, they are armchair investigators who just hear about this read about it in books or something, and then they come up with these hypotheses. But this is just not going to fly anymore. I mean, all of the things that we identify as a near-death experience are commonly reported by people who are standing there at the bedside. Now, when I first started hearing this, the first one I heard was from one of my own medical school professors in 1972.
Dr. Jameson.
Yes, although that's a pseudonym.
Okay.
Yeah, but this is a very wonderful medical professor I had when I went to medical school, and so she had the misfortune of, seeing her mother have a cardiac arrest right in front of her, and had to be the one there trying to resuscitate her mother, and her mother did pass away. But she said that as her mother passed away, she herself, this physician, left her own body, rose up, and to use her exact words, she said, "I was trying to get my bearings," and looked around and saw her mother, again to use her exact words, now in spirit form, there beside her. And she said she could actually look down. She could see her own physical body beside the bed of her mother. She could see her mother's physical body, now deceased, in the bed. And then in this other perspective, she could see that her mother, in this spirit form, now there beside her. She said her goodbyes to her mother, and she said she saw her mother recede into this light and being met by these people, some of whom she recognized as people who had been friends and relatives of her mother's who had passed away. And so back at that period of time, in the on through the 70s and the late 70s, I heard these almost exclusively from medical people, doctors and nurses. And what you hear actually quite often from doctors, I mean, this is not the kind of thing that they're going to tell you about openly unless, they know that you're sympathetic. But doctors will tell you that as the patient dies, sometimes they seem to see something that is very described in one of two ways, but which seem pretty equivalent, really, is that some people describe it as a sort of transparent image or replica of the dying person that sort of stands up and moves away from the body. Or sometimes this is described as a sort of globular, light, grayish and or goldenish, which rises up and leaves the body. And so I began to hear these, like I said, in the 70s and through the early 80s. And then it seems like probably about the mid-80s, there was a shift in it, and I began to hear many more of them from bystanders at the bedside who were like relatives. And concurrently with that, what you were seeing in medical practice is that when I entered medicine in 1972, the standard way of handling the death situation would be that when we saw that the patient was, in the terminal phase, the doctors and nurses would come in, and it was a kind of paternalistic attitude, but what we thought was, it's too overwhelming for the patient's family, so, we'll be the heroes, and so the family would usually sort of be escorted out. But then, in a period of time, this began to shift, whereas now, in 2011, is more the standard practice that the doctors and nurses, unless they have a close personal bond with the patient, and the family, will tend to make themselves scarce and encourage the family to be there with the dying person at the very end.
Which is profoundly better, both for the dying person and for the family. Yeah.
Yes, excuse me. This I should explain to you and to the listeners that just in the past couple of days, the goldenrod has bloomed around here.
Oh.
So that's the cough. I'm terribly allergic to it. But it's a much better system. And so with that, I'm still hearing this from doctors, but much more now from the patients' families. And back in about, it was, to be precise, it was in May of 1994, George. I was out there in Las Vegas, and this was before I went to teach there, but we were planning to put together a systematic study of these these shared death experiences. And it was on Mother's Day, 1994. So after our planning meeting broke up, I called my mom from the shopping mall out there to wish her a happy Mother's Day, and I found out that the day before that she had developed a rash, which they didn't think was serious. But the next day, to make a long story short, she went to the doctor for a more thorough examination, and it turned out to be non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and she was told she had 2 days to 2 weeks to live. Well, my wife and I went there, and we were with my mom at her bedside the whole time, that 2 weeks as it was, until she passed away. But when she did, my wife and I and my brother-in-law and my sister had this shared death experience. And as you know, I'm driven in what I do by curiosity, and that kind of diffused my curiosity. In other words, you can't be too you're still curious about it when it's happened to you, but it was such a shock in a way. And so I spent a long time integrating that, and then I kept on collecting cases of it. So now, as you said, I've put it in this book, Glimpses of Eternity. And I want to give credit, by the way, to my dear friend and co-writer, Paul Perry, who wrote this with me, because Paul and I have been working together and been good friends since 1988. And Paul has written many books on near-death experiences with Melvin Morse as well, who's the pediatrician who's done this. But we've put this together, and I think, this is bound to change the whole tenor of the debate, because we can't get away anymore with trying to run away from this by saying, oh, this is just brain damage, or the person there is during the resuscitation, the oxygen flow is cut off, because that just totally fails to explain why the bystanders have the same experience.
Well, let's jump back to your experience. Now, you and your wife and your in-laws went where? What happened?
Well, George, my experience actually tends to be fairly typical of a lot of this that I've heard from other people, too. And this is just as I've heard from so many people over the years, and you have, too. It's like people say, there are no words. The words sound crazy, but this is what I experienced as my mother was in the process of dying. George, I don't know how to explain it except that the room changed configuration. We were no longer in a three-dimensional space. The best way I can describe this is the configuration of the room, instead of like being a three-dimensional box or cubicle like a hospital room is. It was kind of like you were in the apex of a funnel or a double funnel, kind of like an hourglass. Like the room seemed to sort of pinch up in the middle is the only way I know it. It's like we were in a sort of like a funnel of light. That just sounds so bizarre. But the structure of the room changed, or the geometry of it changed, and the tenor of the light. People say light, but that's a misnomer. The reason you have to say light is that that's the only word that's even vaguely like it. You could also say love, and it wouldn't be any different. It's love or light, or this sheer love energy or light energy just permeates everything. And people who might tend to think that this is some kind of dream-like thing, this is more real than ordinary waking consciousness. This is not like a dream. When people wake up in the morning from a dream, they feel like they're coming back to reality, right? Because when you wake up in the morning, you've had in some sort of odd dream, and you're trying to hold on to those bizarre images, but then it kind of fades because you think, what is that? You have this feeling that you're coming back to reality. Well, and the kind of experience I'm talking about, you have that same feeling, except this reality is what's the dream, is the weird thing. I mean, that is more real than this ordinary waking consciousness. And for that reason, the language we try to use to describe it just breaks down. And it is just absolutely astonishing. My sister saw the presence of my father there at my mother's death, and my father had died 18 months before. This is another very common thing people say, that they say that as the person in the bed dies, that they see the spirits of the deceased person's loved ones sort of come around or enter the room as a sort of to take them away. Another thing that happens is that the room, or as I mentioned, just full of this vibrant light. And music is another thing I hear all the time. Just like I was talking to this family not long ago, and one of the family members said to one of the others, "Do you hear that music that I'm hearing?" And people say that this ethereally beautiful music fills up.
It's not harp music, is it?
No, that's very interesting. There was a study done actually by a musicologist some years ago who also happened to be a clinical psychologist, where he interviewed, I think it was 17 people who had heard music in their near-death experiences, and then he developed the scale to try to figure out what kind of music it was. And everybody agreed that it's George Ritchie. And George was not a person who was, conservative in his values. In saying this, he did not mean to put down the Beatles, but George said that there was no way he could describe it. He said he would have to say that as a rough measure, for example, it's more like Beethoven than the Beatles was his. People say this absolutely unearthly music, just beauty that you can't describe.
Symphonic as opposed to a pop song.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And
did you said now that your sister saw your dead father. So
yeah.
The four of you who went along with Mom did not all have the same exact experience. No,
it's like the way I put it together, and I base this not just on my own family's case, but on the other cases I've dealt with where more than one person saw it, is that it's kind of just like if you and I went on a tour to Paris.
Hey, Raymond, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but that music tells us we're going to a break, and I got a feeling we're going to want to hear this line from you uninterrupted. So we're going to take a break now, folks. We'll be back with Dr. Raymond Moody, author of the new book, Glimpses of Eternity, to talk about the shared death experience. Stay with us. Dr. Moody, I want to give you the chance to finish the story you were telling right before the break, and then I want to get into some of the case studies, the case examples that you use in the book, Glimpses of Eternity, because they are very powerful and very moving.
Yes. Well, George, what I was saying before was that I have lots of cases where more than one person at the bedside saw something, and just as with any other situation, even in the physical world where there are several witnesses, everybody tells it from a little bit different perspective. And in my case, how do I even begin to describe this? But basically, to put it in context, I very often hear from people in that circumstance that as their loved one dies, the bystanders themselves feel like that they get out of their physical bodies, and they accompany their dying loved ones partway toward this light. And I didn't do that, but it was really obvious even in that situation that I could have, in the sense that, for want of a better term, I was looking directly into my mother's eyes and relating to her that way. But I knew even if that, in that situation, I sort of intuitively sensed that if I had turned my attention inwardly, upward, rather than looking at my mother, I would have gone out of my body. I have no question about it. Even though I have never had an out-of-body experience, but I was right there on the verge of it. And so I think that there's a commonality in these experiences, but that doesn't mean that every single person is going to have every single aspect of it. Even when there's various people there at the bedside of the dying, all of them might experience it in a little different way, and yet there are overlaps to it.
Is it your guess? I mean, here's what I have in my head is this image of like a giant cosmic vacuum cleaner sort of sucking up souls of the people who are dying, and somebody is sitting there next to them, and they get kind of sucked up as well. I know there's no definitive answer, but what would be your guess? Is it accidental? Is it incidental? Is it on purpose that people would be taken along and shown some of this stuff?
I have no idea, but I mean, these are huge mysteries. I don't even think that we haven't even scratched the surface yet on understanding this. And once we really realize that the barriers have broken down, partly because of my work, we've defined this near-death experience as a thing with certain boundaries and sort of connect it with people who almost die. But now that we know, and sort of to go along with the imagery that you're talking about there, now we can see in some way that this same kind of experience kind of leaks out there at the bedside, and that other people can be taken up into it too. Gives you the idea that maybe it's, what sort of metaphor can we use? Maybe that there's some sort of portal or passageway opened up at the point of death, and that just opens up immense possibilities. Another complicating factor here, George, is that physical proximity is not, it seems to help it along, but it's not a necessary condition. For example, back in the early 80s in Charlottesville, my family and I were at the basketball game, and the UVA basketball game. And it happened that the person sitting in the seat next to us was a lady that we were acquainted with, and she had brought a friend of their family who was a young man, and I think he was in his early 20s at that point. And so she introduced him to us, and introduced him to me by saying that, Raymond Moody is the man that wrote that book about near-death experiences and so on. Whereupon this young man started telling me this story of how about 3 years before his identical twin brother had died. He had an identical twin, and they were 18 at that time. But there was a several state separation. His brother, for some reason, was in another state. But out of nowhere, this young man said that he suddenly started feeling like he was out of his body and going through this passageway and so on. And so as you can guess, it turned out several hours later that he found that exactly that time he had this experience, that his brother had died unexpectedly several states away. And so the time-space continuum, is violated here. It doesn't have to be. You don't have to be physically close for this to happen. So we are here into something that, I mean, this is not going to go away, for one thing. I mean, this is not some fad or something that, that we're going to be able to ignore much longer, because, I mean, this is out in the open now. And what does this mean?
Nor is it new. I mean, you make that point in the book. I mean, it's probably been around a long time. Could be that somebody had this experience way back when, and they go over and see what seems like heaven, and they come back and tell people about it, and it forms the basis of religions.
It forms the basis of religions, I think. A matter of fact, George, I'm beginning to suspect. I mean, if you think about Homo erectus, for example, the immediate sort of ancestor, these things that weren't quite Homo sapiens. As I understand, I mean, I'm certainly not an anthropologist, but my reading of the literature available on this seems to suggest that in the Homo erectus, that when one of the members of that group would die, the others would just walk away from the body, so there wasn't burial. Apparently, it's only with Homo sapiens, and I think that includes Homo neanderthalis, that people began to bury their fellow human beings in such a way as to indicate that they thought that there was something else. And what that leads me to suspect, George, I mean, how do you make final decisions about things like this? But my guess is that was the point where we became human beings, was when we acknowledged sort of that there's something afterward. And that these experiences, the near-death experiences and the shared death experiences, I think, are the origin of the idea of life after death. In other words, that people got the idea that there is an afterlife because they began to reflect on these experiences that people had when they almost died and returned, or when they were there with a dying relative. And that's how this whole notion of an afterlife came about through these experiences. And that, if you think about it, there have been all sorts of attempts among anthropologists and thinkers and so on to locate that one feature that makes us uniquely human. Well, for a long time they thought it was language. Well, a lot of doubt has been cast on that. They say, well, maybe chimps can master language. And I think just recently it's been discovered that dolphins have names, incredibly. In other words, that there are these symbols in the dolphin life that each dolphin has its own name. And so that eliminates the language as being the distinguishing feature. And it's not tools. Certainly they've found that chimps make tools. Even crows make tools by bending paper clips and so on into the right shape. So all the things that we used to think of as unique to humans has sort of fallen by the wayside. But the only one I can think of that is unquestionable is, as far as we know, human beings are the only species that has an intimation or an idea that there's something beyond this life.
Let's talk about a couple of cases, because some of these are just, they raise the hair on your arms. Some of the kinds
absolutely do. And, and I've got hundreds more like that. I mean, it's endless.
Things that people learn during this that they come back and confirm. For example, you have a case where a woman, her husband is dying. She goes over to the other side, learns things about him in her review, the review of his life, about, I think it was girlfriends earlier in his life, and she comes back and figures out they're real people. She tracks them down.
That's right. And, I mean, I have so many cases that I just, the one that comes to my mind along those lines is I am so touched by is a woman who had one of these relationships with her husband where they had literally been childhood friends, like just right down the block, living, together in this small town, and had sort of grown up dating other people, but then in high school decided really, they were such good friends that, that was the natural marriage. And then in the context of that, she was they found out she was pregnant before their actual marriage was planned, which in that time in the state of Georgia, I should assure you, was a big, horror, like a scandal. But anyway, they had a good sense of humor about it, and they were just in the process of trying to figure out how they're going to spring this on their parents. And so, but in that context, sadly, she had a spontaneous miscarriage, which was a very sad thing to them. But the local sort of town doctor helped them through it. And so for the rest of their marriage, which was some decades, I forgot how long, but, 20 or 30 years, a long time, they never had any other children, but they throughout their marriage kept, they would always talk about this child they lost as though he had been a boy. They would say things like, now he would have been 6 years old, and so on and so on. And anyway, in the event, what happened was that her husband developed a very rapidly acting lung cancer, and she was there with him in the hospital as he passed away, and she said, as he died, this like panorama sprang up around them, all these details of his life. But she said it was very clear that he was talking to her about these scenes of his life that he was seeing too. And she related that in that area of the panorama that had to do with the loss of their child, she said this presence of light came out and identified itself, or not as their son, but as their daughter. And she said that was, a very fulfilling thing to her. That was the last contact she had with her husband was that he was being there and being reunited with this child that they had lost before they even got married. And I mean, a lot of this stuff is just, very, very powerful.
There's an example you use about a guy who's in the hospital with Alzheimer's. He's dying, and his brain is just pretty much mush. He's gone, and then toward the end, he wakes up and he's having a conversation with someone named Hugh.
Yeah.
Remember that one?
Yes, and what happened was that the family concluded that was him just sort of talking out of his head because Hugh was alive. And then, as you can imagine, what it turned out was that no, Hugh was dead, just as this woman's husband was saying there, and what they were interpreting as a delirium, but it turned out to be a reality. And when you hear enough of these things, I mean, at some point you just got to throw up your hands and say, "I give up." You and I have known each other for a long time, actually, and you know that I am, a skeptic in the genuine sense, because, it's just for a long time, it was very hard for me to draw a conclusion that this is real, because I just was not born religious. I was an amateur astronomer from the age of 7, and I never even knew that anybody took the notion of an afterlife seriously until I was 18 years old and reading Plato, because not being religious, I just wasn't exposed to all this. And it's been a long process for me, George, but just a couple of years ago, I found myself in this situation where, looking inside of myself, when I would try to come up with some other way of putting this all together, other than to say, that there's a life after death. I mean, trying to come up with some other way of putting it together, I realized that I felt that I was trying to escape from something, and I was trying to rationalize rather than just to face what seems to be. And what seems to me now, gathering all these things that I know together, is that I think this is life after death. I really do. But then, so what? That's one man's opinion. But what I think more importantly here, George, is that we now have new conceptual systems for putting this together in a way for it to add up to like some sort of rational justification of the idea of an afterlife, because the two things are coming together. Plato was really a very wise person. That's why we still read him after 2,300 years. He was just a sheer genius of, an enormous magnitude. And Plato, even 2,300 years ago, pointed out that when you're investigating life after death from a rational point of view, there's always got to be two things. He said, number one, there's always got to be some kind of storyline attached to it. Because, the notion itself of an afterlife is not real clear. So Plato said you've got to have some sort of story. But then in addition, he said, no matter how many stories you have, then you got to have some set of concepts to pull it all together to connect it with the notion of an afterlife in some rational way. And for a variety of reasons I won't go into, but this is my opinion too, that scientific method as we have it in 2011 is not yet adequate to put this together. We need some sort of bridging concepts first, and that's what I think is coming. I think that we are really standing on the verge of a revolution, George, in the rational study of life after death. And I can absolutely predict with certainty another 5 years down the road, it's going to be a whole different picture. I think that there will be entirely new rational means of investigating the question of life after death.
Well, I hope you're right. I'm not sure I'm as optimistic. I've seen the resistance of science to exotic ideas on so many topics, and the resistance almost becomes a religion in its own way, where they don't want to accept things. It can't be, and therefore it isn't. But of course, the implications of this research would be enormous in so many ways. We'll get into the implications of what it means. Also, are all these experiences positive, or do you have some negative experiences on the other side? We'll get into that as well as we continue our conversation with Dr. Raymond Moody here on Coast to Coast AM. His book, again, called Glimpses of Eternity. Peter Gabriel takes us into the break. Dr. Moody, are the experiences universally positive? I mean, the people who have this shared death experience, they go somewhere else. Is it always a good place, or is it any of them coming back and saying, I went to hell?
No, I do have some cases over the years of near-death experiences where people had negative experiences, although that's only a very small fraction. But actually, in the cases of shared death experiences I've had, I've never heard anybody have a negative. And maybe I will. Maybe they are out there, but I've never come across one. We do have cases of negative near-death experiences, though. But it's harder to study something where you only have very small numbers. And apparently, all the studies seem to suggest that the percentage of near-death experiences that are negative is very low, and so therefore it's harder to study them because there are fewer of them.
But when you say the percentages are low, you still think the numbers are pretty big, that there could be millions of people who've had these experiences?
I don't know about millions, but yeah, I mean, in terms of an absolute number, probably a lot of people who've had negative experiences. One problem in studying them, in addition to being they're statistically rarer, but also the fact that they're a lot more variegated. That is, that where in the positive ones there's more of a homogeneity, and the negative ones are all spread out, and they tend to follow three patterns. And one pattern, it's the people say that they experience the same kind of thing that people say with the positive experiences, except rather than feeling of it as a pleasant thing, it's frightening to them. Then a second pattern is that the experience begins negative, but then it turns into the positive type. And then the third category of the negative ones, and the rarest of all, is the category of people who actually see hellish things. And, one complicating factor here, of course, is that you can't rule out the possibility of underreporting. It might, it could be that people who have negative experiences are just less likely to talk about them. We just don't know. But, it's harder to study them for all those reasons.
I understand that you can't answer this. I'm asking you to speculate, but I wonder why it doesn't happen to everyone.
I have no idea. It's we can say definitely what it's not. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with the age of the patient or the particular medical condition that brought them close to death. It doesn't even seem to have anything to do with whether or not they had a prior religious background. But we just don't know why some do and some don't. It's a real mystery.
Is there any common denominator among the people to whom it does happen? Like these people needed to learn this lesson?
Not as far as I can tell. I mean, it's just, and, for years I've been puzzled about this, George. I mean, I just, all the kinds of things you can think of that you might guess just don't seem to apply. I just don't know. I don't know why some do and some don't.
The stories of this panoramic life review, some of them are inspirational, some of them kind of funny. I guess a lot of embarrassing tidbits pop up in these things. The people who have this shared death experience learn something about a loved one, a sibling, a husband or wife, or something like that, things they didn't know before. But I guess it covers the whole ball of wax. I can only imagine there's big chunks of my life I wouldn't want to share with.
Exactly. See, I mean, that's exactly, I am astonished by this, because to me this sounds very intrusive. It's not anything I would want to happen to me, and yet the people I talk to about this say, no, it's not that way at all, that you don't think of it as something intrusive, that when it happens, it's perfectly natural. And then another thing, I guess, that kind of, I realize that in being a psychiatrist all these years, is really the fact is, George, we all have pretty much the same secrets, you know what I mean? And it's once you say anything, that's happened to you that's embarrassing or whatever, and you let the cat out of the bag, well, there's always somebody right there in the room, right, who can say, well, yeah, that happened to me too. I mean, that's just human life. We like to think of ourselves as so different and unique, and so, like we like to think of that our sins are much worse than other people's sins and so on. But in reality, we're all just sort of clumped up pretty close together in the same ballpark, I guess. I mean, we've all done things we wish we hadn't have done.
Sure. Is it safe to say that you think that this does constitute evidence of life after death? Does it mean we have a soul, that we're immortal, that we what is it? I guess you could ask a million questions. What does it mean about reincarnation? What does it say about ghosts? Because there are a lot of reports of ghostly type apparitions that probably fit into this equation somewhere.
Well, yes. I mean, all the questions you can that you can raise. I mean, they just go on endlessly, because this is the biggest question of existence: do we live after we die? And you ask about whether I think this really is evidence. Well, what I will say this: I've never been very retiring about my points of view. I mean, I just say what I think, and I'm not trying to be evasive with this, George, but where I think the real question is not so much is this evidence of life after death, but what kind of thing could be evidence of life after death is the real problem from the logical point of view. I don't think that the advance and the rational investigation of life after death is going to come initially from science. I think it will be from some other sort of rational inquiry, like some logical or philosophical thinking. In other words, somebody has got to come along and develop the logical structure for thinking about this question of life after death. And I'm pleased, incidentally, that you are dubious, that you don't have this, this confidence that I do, because, we should have a challenge here. I should say, together we should issue this challenge. And I would say that given certain conditions, which are not hard to meet at all, really, just to have a little group of subjects to put this thing where we seem to disagree a little bit here to a test. And what I would predict is that I have a method of taking people through a process that actually reformats their mind to think rationally in a whole new way about life after death. And this takes me like 2 days, like from 8 to 6 each day. And it's got to be people who are very selected, and then you're going to say, oh, there it goes, this is where the wiggle room. But no, to the contrary. The conditions are that, number one, these have to be people who do not believe in life after death, okay? And not hostilely, like the so-called skeptics. I mean, these people who are constantly, talking about it, well, deep down, I think probably they tend to believe, right? That's why they're acting in this cynical and scoffing way. I'm talking about the people who are really just like, this is never even an issue for them, because they think it's illogical. And that given people with this profile, that number one, they have a talent for reasoning and analysis. They're really good analytical thinkers. And that number two, they're patient and persistent, which is operationally defined as the patience to follow instructions for 2 days and go through some exercises to reformat the mind. I would predict with absolutely conviction that we could assemble a group of people like that, and I would have to select them, because see, I mean, it's like if you get in people who believe in an afterlife, they already are made up in their mind about how the format they want this presented in. I'm talking about people who are just neutral. They just, to them, life after death isn't even remotely in the cards. But that they are good analytical reasoners. And they would have to go into this with the idea that what this is all about is I'm going to learn a new system of logic, and I'm going to open up parts of my mind that have been shut down. And then getting that study group, that group of people together over a 2-day period, what I'm predicting with absolute confidence is that we could get them at the end of the program to answer this question. Do you feel that this is a genuine, rational advance toward the rational comprehension of life after death, I'm just absolutely confident they would tell us yes. That's what I'm saying. I think that paradoxically, the new advances in the question of life after death are not going to be received very well by what I call the afterlife establishment. The people who, they think that they already know how to investigate this. It's got to be sort of taken out of their hands into this entirely new framework. And that's where I'm betting that you and I would come to the agreement that, this is a real advance.
Well, I think we're closer than you might suspect.
Oh, yeah, I know, like I said, we've, you and I have known each other for a long time. I'm saying this in a way to say that, just to sort of operationalize it, to say that, yeah, I'm that confident of it.
I think that would be fun. The only part I was dubious about, I think the book is very moving and powerful, and I'm right there with you. I mean, these are questions that we all ask. These are questions that, for myself, I've never been able to resolve to any satisfaction, at least in my own head. The part I was dubious about was about whether scientists would take it seriously, and I think you've answered that.
I think what scientists will take seriously is this new logic. That's what they will. And then once you have the new logic down, then the implications for the afterlife question are there. And it's, that's just a matter of a simple inference.
There's so many big questions in implication-wise. Let's say that people accept this. It's no longer a matter of religious faith. It's an established fact of some sort that it's widely accepted. You go on, you're eternal. Do people kill themselves and to go over and go to heaven?
Absolutely not, because a pretty much a unanimous opinion from people who have near-death experiences is that that's not the way to go. It doesn't do any good. People with who have near-death experiences from a suicide attempt tell us that never again would they attempt suicide, because they say it's just not a solution. If you're trying to get away from the problem, what you find is that the problem is just translated to a different framework. And but also at the same time, I think that sometimes you hear people say things like, oh, if we could have rational proof of life after death, that everything would be wonderful and kumbaya on the earth. Well, that's nice to hope for, but I just don't know. I don't know. But what I do know for sure is that a rational proof of life after death would, I think, absolutely restructure the human mind, and in a very good way, because the expansion of our mind that would have to take place to bring this huge question of life after death within the domain of reason, then in itself that process would just dramatically alter the human mind, and not just in relation to the afterlife question. I think that the logical steps that would have to be done to bring that about would have implications for all kinds of other fields as well, cosmology and psychology. And I'm not talking here about something, off in the future. I'm talking about now. This is just, this already exists. It's just going to be a period of time, to sort of filter out to the bigger population. Because this is something that is actual. And, I'm just, I'm very excited about this. It never would have occurred to me that we would have a genuine rational advance toward the afterlife question. But I'm saying definitely now that there is. And you know me. You've known me long enough to know I'm very conservative. I don't draw inferences until I'm absolutely sure that anybody who worked through this for themselves wouldn't come to the same conclusion. So we're on the verge of big things here.
You ever see anything in any of your case studies referencing reincarnation, that people are over there and they're talking about coming back in a different form or a different body?
George, out of the thousands of cases that I've heard, there have only been 3 in which people specifically mentioned reincarnation, and 2 of them, incidentally, were Southern Baptists, totally outside of the framework. And the third one was an architect from Zurich who was a Hungarian man who was a figure in the revolution but escaped after the Hungarian Revolution of '56 and ended up an architect in Zurich. And he, during his near-death experience, saw scenes from previous lives which he was then later able to go and find. But so there's not much direct information from near-death experiences about reincarnation. However, that's kind of what you would expect, since people, that they only sort of get to the antechamber of the afterlife in these near-death experiences. However, a lot of people who come back from near-death experiences say that because of what they saw, they wouldn't at all be surprised. In other words, that at least it opened up their minds to the possibilities because of what they saw on the other side.
I'd be very interested. I don't remember seeing this in the book, but whether there's any references to animals, pets, souls for animals, are they going through the same kind of a journey?
Absolutely. And once in a while in near-death experiences, people do talk about seeing pets. And, George, I kind of suspect that this is underreported in the sense that I gather that people are kind of embarrassed, or I know, for example, that in grieving, I am a grief counselor all the time. I mean, that's one of the main things I do is counsel people about grieving. And one thing I've noticed over the years is that people are very embarrassed often when they're grieving about their pets because they feel like other people will think that it's weakness or whatever. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if a lot more people have some sort of experience with a pet.
All right. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Ray Moody is our guest, talking about his new book, Glimpses of Eternity. That music tells us we're going into a break. When we come back, we open up the phone lines with your questions. So stay with us here on Coast to Coast AM. Dr. Ray Moody, there's a section in the book where you talk about a missing sense mechanism in regard to these shared death experiences. And that discussion sort of it touches on subjects that we've discussed on this show many times: telepathy, clairvoyance, remote viewing, astral projection. Is it all tied together? I mean, does this, the research that you've done, the case studies that you've heard, tie it all together?
Perhaps so, in the sense, George, that these things just don't operate according to the time-space framework that we think we're in. It's people can be all the way across the country, and yet in this unknown kind of way, be aware that their loved one is dying. To me, it's just that after hearing this from so many thousands of people over so many years, including, incidentally, just people that I knew in other frameworks of life who didn't come to me because, they had such a story. But that sounds so vague, but let me give you an illustration. One of my wonderful graduate students of psychology years ago that I knew, she was a wonderful student and became a good friend. And then I sort of lost track of her, and she had recently I found that she has been for some years working in a hospice. She became a hospice nurse after I knew her, and she recently told me of the story of as her grandmother was dying, she was across town and heading toward the hospital, and she said, on the way in the hospital, she said she suddenly became aware of her grandmother right there in the car with her, and saying, well, that saying goodbye and that she had passed away. And then, as you can imagine, when she got to the hospital, it was a fact. And my point being that I had known this wonderful student in a totally different context, her just a person of immensely good judgment. And when people tell you the same story repeatedly, it becomes irrational at some point not to give this credence.
You also mention in the book that what you've learned from the shared death experience is probably more profound than from the near-death experience.
I think it is, George. And one thing I've noticed about this is I think initially there was a lot more resistance to these shared death experiences than to the near-death experiences. And let me explain. I have been actually talking about the shared death experiences, I guess now for 20 years. Talking about it in public. And quite frequently during that time, I would give an interview to a TV show or something. And when they would come to interview me about near-death experiences, and then in the course of the interview, I would put in the material about the shared death experiences. And interestingly enough, that was always edited out. Well, I got to thinking about that, and what I realized, and this is just a conjecture, but I think there may be something to this, and that is that I think that, in a way, the notion of the shared death experience might be hitting a little too close to home with people in this respect. Most of us have a hard time imagining our own death, and so therefore when we hear somebody with a near-death experience, that enables us to keep it at a distance. The near-death experience is something that happened to someone else, not to me, because people have a harder time imagining their death. However, it's a lot easier for people to imagine maybe being there at the bedside of a mother, for example, who's dying, or a father, or a grandmother, or whoever. And so, for that reason, I think that people put up a resistance to it. You see what? Does that make sense at all?
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's my sense of it, that this stirs something. You put it in terms of being profound. I think that's right. I think that this, in one way, is something even more profound to people than the near-death experience, because, number one, it's easier for them to come to grips with the fact that it might happen to them, so that makes it less of a distance, therefore, and also because there's just no obvious way of explaining this. In the society that we live in, which is kind of racked with scientism, basically, that people...
The religion of scientism, that is,
right,
yeah.
That people have a rough and ready way out of this. If they don't want to accept this, or, that the possibility of an afterlife is just too much, they don't want to have to deal with that, then the shared death experience is going to be something very harder for that crowd, because the easy out of saying, well, this is just the brain going haywire, is not going to hack it. And then I think also people have the intuitive realization that if they change horses in midstream here, that sort of undermines the case. And what I mean by that is, in critical thinking and logic. I've been, that's one of my specialties. I've taught critical thinking and so on for a long time. And one of the rules of critical thinking and that you teach people is that that when somebody changes grounds on you, then that's a sign of a weak case. And so therefore, if somebody, if you present to them the information about near-death experiences and they say, well, that's just brain damage, that's just the oxygen flow being cut off and it creates this hallucination. But then you say to them, well, but the same experiences take place to people who are standing at the bedside, and they say, well, that's just wishful thinking or that's just hysteria. You see, that's not fair. That's like to shift the reason for your objection. And that's why I'm so baffled by this, because there doesn't seem to be any real plausible way out of that.
Yeah, well, back in my debate years, we would have called that a shift. Yeah, exactly the term that you used.
Yeah, a shift. Yeah, if you can't shift grounds, that's not fair. If you want to subscribe to rational principles, then you gotta, follow it all the way through. And if you do, then you're left with something. Well, what is this?
Let's go to the phones, Raymond, and see what's on people's minds. On the wild card line, Bill in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Bill?
Yes, I had two things, but I don't think she says I have time but for one, so I'll do as quickly as I can.
Okay.
When my wife's, and this is the reason it concerns me about this, is because my wife's mother had been real sick. She's in the hospital about 40 miles away from where me and my wife live up here in Auburn. She was down in Columbus, Georgia. And she had this pickup truck that she had just truly loved and did not want anything to happen to it. And the family was kind of fighting over it before she died. And she told my wife, here, you take it. I want you to have it because you need it. Well, to make a long story short, we got a call one night to come to the hospital that she didn't have very much time left. So we knew that, okay? Mm-hmm. But on the way down to Columbus, Georgia, about 35, 40 miles, and this truck had never, ever done anything like this. My wife was driving, okay? And all of a sudden, this truck sort of just died and then picked up again, and we both looked at the dash clock on it. Mm-hmm. Well, when we got to the hospital, her time of death
was the time she died.
Was the exact same time that was on that dash clock when that truck hesitated or paused or whatever it did.
Oh.
Yeah, Bill, I hear things like this all the time, absolutely, yeah.
And I experienced it too, and I mean, we weren't close in any kind of way.
Yes, yeah.
So,
that thing you raised about closeness, that's a very interesting factor too. It's like you would think, well, maybe what brings about this connection is a personal closeness or something, and yet, it can be all the way across the country, as you're talking about here, or, miles away, and yet it happens. And another interesting thing is in terms of the emotional closeness, that...
Yeah, it was a stressful thing knowing that, and we'd never told anyone, like her sisters or anything about that, because, they think we're like, cuckoo.
Crazy. That's right.
All right, well, thank you very much, and maybe I'll get back another day to somebody or to you and get my other question.
Well, wait a second. What is it? What is it?
All right. When me and my wife first got married, and we were coming from Mississippi to Georgia, and we came through Selma, Alabama, and I had never been to Selma in my life, okay? And all of a sudden, when we turned on the street, I told my wife, I said, the bridge, that we're going to go over a bridge in just a minute. And I started getting, I don't know if it's near death or what you call it, but I started getting this morbid sort of a feeling that came over me, or whatever you want to call it. And every time we ever made that trip and I'd get by that bridge, I did. And so finally one day I did some research, and I don't know if there's anything to it, but the day before my birthday, while they were building that bridge, a man was killed pouring the concrete on that bridge. Now, that's all I got to say, but I wondered what in the world has that got to do with me? I was born on the 19th of October, 1946, and this happened on the 18th of October, 1946.
Wow.
And I just wonder why. And I have a fear of this bridge, even today.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. That's very interesting.
Crazy.
Yeah, interesting.
But, there's kind of near death. It has to do with that, but I don't know. There's so much we don't know, but I've listened to you tonight, and you've helped me see a lot of things, and, of course, Coast to Coast always does.
Bill, we appreciate the call. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us, and Dr. Moody's down there in your neck of the woods. You're calling from Auburn. He also lives in Alabama.
I do, yeah.
So you might want to check out the book. Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it. We're going to go to a break in a couple of minutes, Raymond, so I don't want to take another call and interrupt it. But let me ask you this. I alluded to this in the introduction to this hour, is the message that comes across of being good to each other, love one another. Tell me a little bit more about that. And is that a message that people are ready to hear? I mean, we profess to live by those rules. A lot of us do anyway, but I'm not really so sure we believe it.
You know something? I think that after all these thousands of people I've talked with, George, I am absolutely convinced that that is what life is all about, is learning how to love. And at the same time, let's sort of try to imagine that we could prove this, that these experiences are real. I am not sure that even that would bring people around to actually behaving in this way, because even people with near-death experiences who see it for themselves, who see every detail of their life played out around them in this hologram and actually feel the hurt feelings they brought about in other people through their actions, will tell you that doesn't make it any easier to get through the average day. It's like the way I like to say it is, let's face it, it's hard to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person. And what people say is that after this experience, you see the importance of learning to love, but that doesn't change your human nature. And you still find yourself flying off the handle or saying things you wish you hadn't said or so on. So it doesn't change human nature. George Ritchie once told me, he said, Raymond, this experience makes your humanity even more of a burden in a way. And that's what he meant, that even after seeing this vision of love, it's hard. George used to get up every morning at 4 a.m., to meditate and pray before he would start seeing his patients in the morning. And he said, life is very hard, even if after you've had something like this happen, it's still hard to control that human nature. Now, in the broader scope of things, it's, abstractly, if you're coming into your life knowing that it's just temporary thing anyway, you would want some bad things along with the good, right? Just to have some variety and
sure,
understand things.
Make it interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of people on the phones will be taking more of their calls. The book is called Glimpses of Eternity by Dr. Raymond Moody, and I'll tell you, it is a lot to digest for you, and it certainly has affected my view of things in the few days since I've finished reading it. Dr. Moody will continue in a moment. I think we're going to go into a break right now. Are we? Okay. Yeah, we're going to a break right now. We'll come back and we'll go back to the phones. My guest, Dr. Raymond Moody, here on Coast to Coast AM. East of the Rockies, John in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Good morning, John. What's on your mind?
Good morning, George. Good morning, Dr. Moody.
Good morning, sir.
I just wanted to, first of all, thank Dr. Moody. In November of '75, I had a bad automobile accident, and I had that life after life experience. And I was rushed to a hospital, but they said I was had already expired. Anyway, the doctors in the hospital were able to restore me. While I was away, I was floating above, watching them work on me, and watching the ins and outs of the, I guess, of the ER and the OR. I went into the hallway and saw people out there. I was afraid I had lost my mind, and was fearing for my sanity. I didn't tell anybody. I waited about 2 years before I told my wife, and she confirmed that she thought I was losing my mind.
Mm-hmm.
But I started heavy drinking after that. I was disabled as a result of the accidents.
Mm-hmm.
And late in '77, about 2 years later, I went to a psychiatrist, and I finally told him. I hadn't told anybody. And he listened to this, and after 2 sessions, he gave me your book.
Wow.
And he said, read this, and I'll see you next week. And so I did, and I was, oh my God, this is fantastic. This is okay. I'm not losing my mind.
Yeah, really.
And and then a few months later, this was, I thought, was really something. I was still seeing the doctor, and I had stopped drinking because I figured, well, I'm not losing my mind, so I may as well try and do something. And I was still disabled from the accident, but he said, John, he had called me one day, and the receptionist called and said, hold the doctor. He came on. He said, John, I can't meet you tomorrow at the office. I have to meet you at the hospital. And he said, there's a little room off the rotunda in the main entrance there. He said, right here, he said, could you just wait right outside that little room? And I said, surely, fine. So I did, and I was down there. And it was mid-morning. It wasn't real busy in that area, and there people were coming and going. And so finally he showed up. Now, he was late, and I was like, well, gee whiz, but he's a pretty busy guy. So he said, come on inside. I said, well, sure. And we go in a little room, and he says, how you doing, blah, blah, blah. And then he said to me, he says, have you seen anybody out there that you recognize? Mm-hmm. And I said, well, nobody that I know. I said, but yeah, I saw a couple of men over there. I said, look like doctors, I guess, but I do know them, but I've never been to them. I don't know where I saw them from. And so he took me outside into the hallway again, and the two gentlemen are still standing there. And he said, these are the doctors that worked on you the night of your car accident.
Yeah.
And
oh boy.
Room, and he said, I said, yeah. I said, you're kidding. He said, no. You never met them? He said, no. He says, come on, I'll introduce you to them. So he went over and introduced me to them. And
well, John, we're glad to know that you're not crazy. I'm glad you're happy to know you.
I don't know, but
well, you might be crazy.
That really changed a lot of things for me, and I still when I read that tonight you were on, I had to listen to the show.
Thank you so much, and and I can tell you also the part of the story from their point of view, John, is for some reason I think people like to imagine that the medical community is antithetical to this kind of thing, and maybe a few are, but believe me, I know many, many, many physicians who've had patients in their practice who have had that kind of experience, and it totally changed the doctor's life too, in many cases. So I think that I would say from experience, you probably did a very good thing for all of your physicians who were involved in that, because when this happens to somebody under your care, it really does. It's very inspiring.
One of
John,
the things that occurred during my experience was I went through the tunnel and I saw the pinpoint of light, and it grew larger and larger and larger. And the feeling of elation was something that I can still feel it when I think about it. And but there was my grandmother, and she always called me her favorite. And she put her hand up, and she said, "No, Johnny, you not yet. You're not ready.
Yes, not yet.
You have things to do. You have things that you have to take care of." And and that was that. And I've always thought about that, and I still to this day wonder sometimes. I wonder what it is I'm supposed to take care of. I'm 69 years old now. And I wonder what it is I'm supposed to do, because I'm still here, so I probably haven't done it yet.
Yeah, this is something I hear all the time. People say that they are told they've got to go back, they've got something left to do, but they're not told what it is, and it can be very frustrating, as you're describing there. And what I can tell you from experience is that I've known quite a number of those people, and in the passage of time, they often do finally realize what it was they were sent back for. So,
John, I appreciate the call. And Raymond, I guess it doesn't have to be you're sent back to discover a cure for cancer. It could be something. Something very subtle.
Absolutely. And one thing that's often reported in these visions, both in the glimpses of eternity type case of the shared death experience and also of the near-death experiences, is that this being of light that people encounter and meet with is not interested in the time you won the football game or the fact that you were the president of a company or this or that. They say that the focus is on things often that you had even forgotten about that you did, like a spontaneous act of kindness that you had shown someone that you had even totally forgotten about, but that comes back in this life review as a very important thing.
That's a really inspirational sort of a message, I think.
It is.
Wildcard line, David in Atlanta. Good morning, David.
Hey, I've been listening sporadically to this show for at least 10 years, and I would just like to say to you, George, and to you, Dr. Moody, that I think Dr. Moody is the best guest I've ever heard on this show. And, I've heard him a few times over the years, and I say that because unlike many of the people who come on this show and also talk about weird things, including in many cases life after death and near-death experiences, you are, unlike many of them, are obviously sane, Dr. Moody. And it's refreshing to hear somebody approach this with the mind of a scientist and the mind of a self-described skeptic.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I do want to say, however, is that I, too, like everybody else, am a little crazy. I mean, in the sense that, we all are. One thing I learned about in psychiatry is that normal is somebody you don't know very well, right? But at the same time, thanks for that. But I will accept that yes, absolutely. It's I think
somebody said there's nobody who's average.
Exactly. And the way I look at it is
that's not my question, by the way. So I hope you'll give me time for that. But go ahead.
Just that basically it's. I think that and it's easy for me to say I don't know. I think that it's you need to be very careful in making inferences about this kind of thing.
Yeah. And I say this not just because we're from the same city and I believe went to the same high school.
Macon.
Lanier? Didn't you graduate from Lanier?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, Macon. And in fact, my father was a doctor in Macon, and I believe he may have referred you at least one of your original cases that went into your original book.
Oh, yeah? What is the name?
What is his name?
Uh-huh.
Am I allowed to say that in front of
you can say it if you want to say it.
Well, it's Dr. David Mann.
Oh, my goodness, yes. He referred that patient, Alice, I forgot her last name, but yes, Alice something another.
I didn't even know this until very recently. I overheard him telling somebody else this, and I need to ask him about this.
That's right, and Alice, and I forgot her last name. Yeah, exactly.
Particularly now that you confirmed it. But my question relates to skepticism. You initially identified yourself as a genuine skeptic.
Yeah.
I believe to distinguish yourself from the mean-spirited and cynical skeptics whom you referred to later, who are closed-minded in one way, and the opposite way from how these, credulous believers are closed-minded. And you sort of poo-pooed, you barely touched on, I got two questions, George, if you'll give me the time, but you sort of poo-pooed the research in this, and I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit on your reaction to what I believe is the very serious research that has been done in England. I'm a sporadic reader of the Skeptical Inquirer magazine, which writes about all sorts of weird phenomena from a scientific point of view. And don't hold me to this, but there's a researcher, I believe, named Susan Blackmore at the University of Liverpool, who, and probably others, who claim to have found a scientific, physical, neurological explanation for this phenomena or some of this phenomena. The white light is a certain type of neurons firing in the brain. The white tunnel is a certain type of brain activity, and so on. I mean, do you just totally dismiss all that out of hand?
Yes,
or what
I do,
is your,
and this is why.
Position on that?
What I mean by I was a professor of ancient Greek philosophy, and it's something that I really enjoy teaching. And what the skeptics were a group of philosophers that arose in the wake of Aristotle. And Aristotle was the person who codified logic. So what we could say is that Aristotle taught us the procedures for drawing a conclusion, right? And so in the wake of Aristotle, the skeptical movement of philosophy was founded by Pyrrho, Pyrrho, and he is the skeptic. That was his school of philosophy. And what the essence of skeptic is, that they follow every path of inquiry. They ask every question. They really bear down. They think it through as rigorously as they can. And then, and this is the essence of being a skeptic, is that they withhold a conclusion. That's what it means. And they do it not just to be cantankerous, but because they find that they even had manuals to tell you how to do this. Don't draw a conclusion that there's a table right there. It might be a cardboard cutout or a holographic projection or whatever. And the reason they did this was they found if they practiced this assiduously, it does two things. Number one, it expands your mind, and it really does. I mean, it's an amazing experience if you practice the skeptical philosophy. And secondly, if you think of it geometrically, if everybody else is rushing in the same direction to get to the conclusion, but your methodology is to refrain from a conclusion, then what that does is to open up your side vision, right, like your peripheral vision, and you are more likely to see side pathways of inquiry that everybody else missed because they were trying to rush to the conclusion. And that's what being a skeptic is. Now, these modern people who haven't even read the history, they don't even know what a skeptic is. But what they say is, oh, I'm a skeptic about the near-death experience. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. Well, if you unpack that according to what we've just said, what that person is telling you is, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such. So that point of view is a self-contradiction. And you mentioned Susan Blackmore, and I'll say this, I love Susan Blackmore. She's just a delightful person. But, you know, I say this to her face, Susan is kind of a serial ideologue. You can never tell, you know, what's the next thing she's going to be enthusiastic about. And, you know, one of the difficulties with this whole kind of point of view is that people who just have a sort of unidimensional training in physiology or medicine or sort of, and don't really realize the philosophical complexities of this. Really what we are dealing with here is what's called a mind-body problem. And like it or not, in the real world, the fact is that we just don't know how the mind is connected to the material substance of the body. That is a philosophical problem that literally goes back to Pythagoras, who was the first person to sort of talk about this. And the reality is we still don't know. And the people who are advancing these physiological explanations and so on, it's this or it's that or whatever. First of all, there's a half a dozen or more different versions of it. And then, to put it in the real context, we just don't know how the mind is related to the body. That's the reality. And what I've seen over the years is neuroscientists, for example, through their careers when they're younger, and I've known quite a bit of, a number of them who are my same age, that early in their career they had this sort of optimism that, the understanding of consciousness or the explanation of consciousness is right around the corner. But then as their careers go along, eventually as they get older, they sort of say, oh, my God, who knows? I mean, that's the reality. I've got, I don't know how many friends who fit into that category exactly, that when we were young people, they were, sure that, we're the physiological explanation of consciousness is right around the corner. But the older they get, the more they see that this is just not in the cards.
Appreciate that.
That's the real problem with these people who falsely say that they're skeptics without even knowing what the skeptical movement in philosophy was all about.
Well, it sounds like from your description is that it's the antithesis of what skepticism started to be, meaning people are open-minded, absolutely. They're looking at all kinds of explanations, and now
it's become an ideology. You mentioned, the caller mentioned the Skeptical Inquirer, and I love to read that magazine, and I recommend it to all my students, and because it does have some interesting information in there, but after you read it for a while, you see that these people they got their own ideology.
An agenda, sure.
And they claim, it's the so-called scientific movement. Well, a lot of them in there are entertainers. Hey,
Raymond Moody, thanks very much. I can't recommend the book enough. Glimpses of Eternity. I hope it was worth your time to join us tonight.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you so much. And, George, more than anything, it's the wonderful callers and also just the pleasure of being able to talk with you again.
Well, if you ever set up that weekend retreat, that 2-day adventure, count me in for that.
I can guarantee you that this works.
All right. Thanks very much, Raymond Moody. Glimpses of Eternity, again, is the book. Check it out, everyone. Happy birthday to Gina Salvati, our regular call screener who's off tonight, doing the who knows what. Thanks to the crew at Coast to Coast for helping me out tonight. And I'll see you all next month. Good night, everyone.